Now, what got me into this? This is not what I do in my life. I'm a neuroscientist, I'm a biotech entrepreneur, I'm used to giving talks about innovation and how to get drugs to help people who have unmet medical needs. But I got this call on April 28th. I remember it was about 10 o'clock in the morning, a Saturday morning, and I was asked, Corey, did you read the local newspaper 2 days earlier on April 26th? No, I didn't subscribe to it at the time. And they said, well, there's an article by one of the scientists from the park named Sarah Allen, and she's written this thing saying that this oyster farm is doing all this terrible stuff. We're having a hearing in a week and a half. We need you to come because we're concerned that some of the science they're referring to might not be real. This county supervisor, Steve Kinsey, had a good enough instinct. He thought he was not being told the truth, but he wasn't a scientist. And he said, Corey, I trust you. You're a member of the National Academy. Will you read these papers and come to the hearing and simply tell us? Now, little did I know what had actually gone on behind the scenes. It took me a week or two to learn this. It winds up, let me give you the gist of it. There's an oyster farm. It's been there for decades and decades. It's in the middle of a body of water in the middle of this national seashore called Drake's Estero. Any of you who have ever been in Northern California know Point Reyes National Seashore. It's beautiful. My ranch is right across the bay from it, Tomales Bay from it. It's a long story, but someone had bought it who was actually an environmental icon and was doing great things. There were various reasons for policy why they wanted to get rid of the oyster farm. I don't want to talk about that tonight. I actually don't care about the policy. You can ask me privately at the bar tonight. It's not about policy. It's not about oysters. Really, it's about how is our government using science to get their way in terms of a policy decision, and how do certain environmental groups rally behind that. But what had happened was that on April 5th, a few weeks earlier, the superintendent of that park, Don Neubacher, got together with Steve Kinsey. Now, how do I know about this? Kinsey has told me, he's testified to the Inspector General, he's told me about it again in front of Senator Dianne Feinstein. I've heard about this meeting many times. And what he was told that day was the permits for this oyster farm are over. In fact, this guy is an environmental criminal. We've got overwhelming data that he's harming the harbor seals. It's a major place of harbor seal population in this estero. He's harming the harbor seals. They're a protected marine mammal by the Marine Mammal Act. In fact, we think he's committed environmental felonies. This is not just going to be civil. We're going to take out criminal proceedings against this guy. That scared the whatever out of the county supervisor. He called up Dianne Feinstein, who's a friend of his, and he said, Senator Dianne, they're on first-name basis. He said, this is a federal agency telling me that he's going to war, basically, with one of my local ranchers. What am I going to do? And she said, look, I chair the Appropriations Committee for Interior. I will get involved. I've been a little suspicious about this stuff. She has a house in Stinson Beach. She lives out there with her husband sometime. She said, I will get involved only if your supervisors unanimously ask me to get involved. So the hearing that was coming up in a week and a half was to get all the county supervisors to unanimously sign a letter asking Senator Feinstein to get involved. Little did I know what I was getting into. I was asked, would I come read the science and come testify? Now, what I didn't know is there was not only an article in the local paper by one of the park scientists, there was also glossy brochures. Our tax dollars were paying for these very glossy brochures exclaiming all the terrible things that the oyster farm was doing in terms of the environment. Well, let me just give you a couple of the quotes. It was pretty dramatic. The superintendent got up at that hearing a week and a half later, and he said, the harbor seal pupping area in Drake's Estero is seriously threatened. It's amazing how many pups we've probably lost this year. We have a serious problem right now. This is a national issue. Disturbances to seals increased dramatically in 2007. So this was quite strong language. And I remember the first time I met Kevin Lunny, who owns the oyster farm. I met him a few weeks later. And he thanked me for testifying at this hearing. And I said, Kevin, I said, you know, if I ever discover you're harming the harbor seals, I'm all about truth. Like anyone in this room, I mean, we are scientists. Our credibility, our integrity is on the line. It's what do the scientific papers and studies actually show. So I was asked to get involved on the 28th. The hearing was coming up a week and a half later on the 8th. And I read papers. It winds up all the studies had been supported financially by the Park Service. Some of them were papers that they had done. They had been supporting a professor at UC Davis for a number of years, a whole series of master's theses. I won't bore you with the details, but I would sit there night after night at home. There was also a paper from the USGS. I believe it was someone's PhD thesis from USGS back from the early 90s. And I would read these papers and I would go, wow, these papers, it's not exaggeration. You're not talking about a 5% exaggeration in what the conclusions say. Is that if the conclusions to these papers say, gee, there's no evidence of oyster feces and sediments clogging up the eelgrass, the Park Service is saying these papers have shown oil feces clog up the sediments and clog up the eelgrass. If the papers say there's no problems with the fish, the Park Service say there is. They're talking about their own papers. They're talking about papers that they've supported or that have their own scientists as authors. I was stunned. I don't know about you, I've never seen something like this before in my life. And I would read night after night these papers, and by the time I got to the hearing, I was really quite struck. It's probably the most scripted testimony I've ever given, and I also gave them a written document, and I gave a 5-minute testimony. And what happened at the hearing, these are just some of the accusations talking about all the bad things the oyster farm was doing. I'm not going to go through all these details. They've all been actually adjudicated by the National Academy of Sciences, who agrees with me that they're all incorrect. And I encourage you to read the Academy report. We're going to talk about the seals tonight and some really remarkable data. So a lot of different claims were made to say that this oyster farm was let's see, it's the primary source of sediment, it's clogging the estero. They're having effects here on the eelgrass, effects on the fish communities, effects on the harbor seals. Let me make a simple statement that the National Academy of Sciences completely backed up. Every one of those claims is incorrect. Now, the day I went in to testify, I knew they were all incorrect except for the harbor seal claim, because I didn't have access to the latest harbor seal data. They have a monitoring program where they have volunteers who go out with binoculars, and they're out there many days looking and counting how many seals and how many pups and looking at disturbances, and there's a very well-kept database. So the superintendent got up and talked about how many seals they've lost in a national issue. His scientist who had written that paper got up and talked about how serious it was and how much the disturbances were being caused by the oyster farm. Another one of their scientists got up. There were 3 in a row. And then the supervisor asked me to get up. It was a very poignant room that day. On the right-hand side, as you were facing the stage, was all the Park Service and their environmental supporters who wanted to get rid of the oyster farm. On the left-hand side was the oyster farm and its friends. I was not sitting with any of them. I was in the back of the room. I was in the bleachers, the cheap seats back there, listening, and I got up at their invitation to testify. And what I said is, look, and I'll just read you a few lines, there's no evidence that the oyster operation is disturbing the harbor seals. I'd gone through all their reports. You don't have to be a PhD. You don't have to be a member of the National Academy of Sciences. I contend to you a high school student can go through these same papers and the same data. This isn't rocket science. It's not neuroscience. It was pretty straightforward stuff. And what I warned the commissioners about that day was I said, beware. I said, all the data in 2005 and 2006 says there are no disturbances caused by the oyster farm. Beware of sudden claims of new data that refute what I've laid out here today. And in my more detailed written testimony, if such claims are made, insist on seeing the complete database, check for bias, and seek independent review. Have other people look. Don't let them try to pull one over on you. I also said one other thing that day that I gave them, and I want to just tell you, because it actually is a 3.5-year journey. There are times, certainly, my wife is worried about some of the obsession with, going after the messenger if you don't like the message in this case. And what I said to them that day was my only hesitation in coming forward to testify today is the realization that openly expressing my views as a scientist may cause me to come under personal attack by local groups that are determined to remove Lunny's operation, he's the owner of the oyster farm, from Point Reyes National Seashore. Nevertheless, I feel compelled to speak out for good science instructing public policy. Little did I realize how prophetic those comments would be that day 3.5 years ago.